Anem a començar la sessió, de la darrera sessió d'aquest cicle de seminaris que està dedicat al tema ciència passat i present. És un cicle de seminaris organitzat per la Societat Catalana d'Història de la Ciència i l'Institut Interuniversitari López Piñero, el que hem organitzat Ignacio Suay i jo mateix, José Ramón Bertomeu, i que avui acabem amb la darrera conferència que serà impartida per Roberto Cantoni, que té un contracte de Pinós a l'Institut de Ciència i Tecnologia Ambiental de la UAB, de la Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. Roberto Cantoni va estudiar física i després va fer el seu doctorat en Història de la Ciència i la Tecnologia en la Universitat de Manchester, on va fer una tesi al voltant de les polítiques de les prospeccions petrolíferes relacionades amb la diplomàcia, el colonialisme i la seguretat en el sant de la Guerra Freda, comparant Itàlia i França. Una tesi dirigida per Simone Turchetti que es va transformar en un llibre realment molt recomanable, publicat en 2017 en Routledge, Oil Exploration, Diplomacy and Security in the Early Cold War. És un llibre que pertoca molts dels temes que hem comentat al llarg dels darrers seminaris, des del concepte de tecnopolítica, que vam discutir en la darrer seminari d'Anel Marré, a partir dels treballs de Gabriel Hedge, que també Roberto Cantoni fa servir el seu llibre, i particularment per estudiar els oleoductes petrolífers com a entitats tecnopolítiques, serà un tema que apareixerà. També altra qüestió, aquell llibre també molt famós de Timothy Mitchell, al voltant de la democràcia del carbó, o els treballs de Per Hexelius sobre temes de geopolítica, imperialisme i energies fòssils. Tots aquests temes estan dins d'aquest llibre que va ser un part resultat, un resultat modificat de la tesi de Roberto Cantoni i que ha marcat molta de la seva recerca, aquesta aproximació transnacional, temes com la diplomàcia tecnocientífica, geopolítica connectada en geociències, l'imperialisme extractivista, temes que tractarà avui a la sessió. Després, Roberto Cantoni ha estat postdoc en la Universitat de Sussex, en Anglaterra, i on ha estat en un dels grups més importants dedicat a temes d'energia, i també ha passat per Bonn, per Augsburg, en Alemanya, i també en Sciences Po a París, i ara, com hem dit, està a la Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. Els seus darrers treballs tracten qüestions de justícia energètica, que serà un dels temes que tractarà la conferència. També un dels seus últims treballs van al voltant de l'energia solar a Àfrica, l'últim que he vist, que està publicat en una de les revistes importants en temes de ciències socials i energia. És una discussió sobre la justícia energètica en les perifèries urbanes de Burkina Faso i Àfrica del Sud. En aquest sentit, ha treballat temes d'energies renovables, que també van tractar en la conferència anterior. I una altra de les seues línies és el gas d'esquist, les polítiques del gas d'esquist, i particularment a Polònia i França, on ha fet també estudis comparats. I també una altra de les qüestions que probablement també tractarà avui és aquestes polítiques de les transicions energètiques, al que ha dedicat també recentment una discussió de caire més teòric, utilitzant aquesta noció de justícia energètica de la que es parlarà avui. Bé, el tema de la conferència d'avui és The Political Economy of Energy Extraction, Uncontested Past, Controversial Present, i, com sempre, tenim l'oportunitat ara d'escoltar a Roberto Cantoni, al que agraïm moltíssim la seva participació a aquest cicle de seminaris. Ara tindrem uns 30-40 minuts, no, per a fer aquesta presentació, i després podrem fer la discussió oberta, aprofitant les habilitats lingüístiques, plurilingüístiques de Roberto, que podrem fer la discussió tant en català com en castellà, com en francès o italià, no? O en anglès, per suposat, també. Bé, moltes gràcies, Roberto. Únicament, abans de donar-te la paraula, el que voldria és anunciar que el darrer és el cicle de seminari, el darrer seminari, el darrer acte, no, d'aquest cicle de seminaris d'energia passat i present. És un cicle que és una sessió que organitzem amb l'ERI de Sostenibilitat, que també forma part de l'Institut López Piñero, i que estarà protagonitzat per Antonio Turiel, que suposo moltes persones conegueu, i que tindrà una doble sessió, una primera part a la Facultat de Sociologia, on es parlarà de les relacions, o discutirem amb Ernest García també, que participarà en aquesta sessió, amb una discussió de les relacions entre les ciències naturals i ciències socials en temes d'energia. I finalment també per la vesprada tindrem l'oportunitat d'escoltar Antonio Turiel a l'Institut López Piñero. Bé, dono la paraula a Roberto Cantoni, agraint-li de nou l'oportunitat de poder escoltar les seues recerques en aquest camp de la història de l'energia. Endavant, Roberto.
Bueno, d'entrada, també voldria donar-li les gràcies per la invitació i per la presentació. Per mi és molt important de poder presentar els meus treballs a la Universitat de València. I ja que ni el meu català ni el meu valencià són molt desenvolupats, seguiré en anglès. So this is kind of a bit of this seminar is about a number of themes that I've been working on over the last few years. So I think José Ramón has summarized them very extensively and very well, so I won't repeat them. But just to give an idea, I'm going to start from trying to change the slides. Yeah, so I'm going to start from talking a bit about the origins of the concept of extractivism. And then I'm going to talk about the different resources that I've been studying and the different resources that have succeeded in throughout history. So from coal, I mean, obviously coal was not the first energy source that was used, but it's the one for which I think we can start talking a bit about the concept of extractivism on a global level. I will nuance this during my talk. Then I will talk a bit about oil for wars and wars for oil, and especially focusing on Euro-American imperialism in the Middle East and beyond, which stems from my PhD thesis and from my book. Then I will try to make a liaison between oil, gas, and uranium. So not only if oil can be seen as the first commodity that was extracted on a global level and was used to fuel the Euro-American industrial apparatus, then gas and uranium came next chronologically. And this was especially the case when we look at the extractive processes in Africa and from African countries to benefit Euro-American area. But also, although I will not spend a lot of time on South America, obviously also South America and parts of Asia were also areas of high extractive activity at different times in history. Then I'm going to move towards the new energy sources. So when I mention new energy sources, I mean especially renewable energy sources. And I'm going to argue that to a certain extent, they are not completely different in terms of extractivism from the old resources. There are some differences, of course, but not in the main mindset that is underlying the extraction of these resources. And then I'm going to look at the development of environmental movements and environmentalist movements, more or less starting from the 1950s. Well, in fact, starting from the late 19th century, but mostly developing from the 1960s and 1970s on. And in this respect, within this setting, I'm going to introduce the concept of energy justice and why it is important to study energy justice today. And I'll try to do all of this in half an hour, 35 minutes. And so I have watched just a clock in front of myself, so I'll try all my best not to exceed this time. And yeah. So first of all, I wanted to present you with a couple of quotes, well, with one quote especially from Álvaro García Linera on what extractive activity is and what extractivism is. Extractive activity does not equal extractivism, of course. Extractivism is, like all the isms, is a specific kind of extractive activity. And so this is in Spanish, but I can translate it. All societies and production modes have, in their own way, different levels of processing of raw matters. If we conceptualize extractivism as the activity in which only raw matters are extracted, renewable matters or non-renewables, without introducing any major transformation in the labor activity, then all the world society, whether capitalists or not capitalists, are also, to a minor or major extent, extractivist society. So in a sense, this is to warn the researchers that when we use the term extractivism, we need to pay attention, because if we use it in a very broad sense, then we can include all societies from all the world and from all the historical periods. And I think a narrower definition, more to the point definition, is given by Acosta in 2013, where he defines extractivism as the process of extracting natural resources from the earth to sell on the world markets. So we have this specific category, the specific character, which is exportation. So extractive activity, first of all, needs to be the first source of revenue of country X in order to, and then the product, the raw matter that is extracted from this country needs to be, for the most part, exported. So we are already trying to narrow this definition to make it more specific. And Acosta also says that this extractivism, this activity exists in an economy that depends primarily on the extraction of removal of natural resources that are considered valuable for exportation worldwide. So what I've just said. Now the term extractivism can be traced back at least as far as the 1970s as a means of describing developments in the mining and oil sectors. It was promoted mainly by large transnational corporations, as well as by multilateral banks and governments, while those who opposed it from within the civil society and the popular sector also used the term in a different way. In fact, in 2000, with raise to power of progressive governments in South America, a new term has been developed. Instead of extractivism, we talk about neo-extractivism. So the prefix neo is to categorize the new kind of extractivism as an activity that instead of being prevalently and predominantly conducted by transnational enterprises to export, is conducted mainly by national state government either to export or to use the matter in the home country. And it was coined by environmental researchers to mark a point and say, hey, the fact that there is a so-called a progressive government or a socialist government doing this kind of activity doesn't make it less extractive, or doesn't change substantially the character of the extractive process, the extractive process. So it's the kind of a continuation of a similar activity, perhaps with different aims, but doesn't change the scale or the nature of the activity itself. In fact, for the Ecuadorian economist that I mentioned before, Alberto Acosta, extractivism, and I'm quoting here, is a form of accumulation that began to be massively forged 500 years ago, unquote. And this activity was molded since then by the demands of the metropolitan centers of the nascent capitalist form. In this regard, as another researcher, the Argentine political scientist Horacio Machado Arauz affirms, extractivism is not one more phase of capitalism or a problem of underdeveloped economies, but constitutes, and I'm quoting, a structural feature of capitalism as a world economy and a historical geopolitical product of the differentiation, the original hierarchization between colonial territories and imperial metropolises, the ones thought as mere space of looting and plundering done for the provisioning of the others, unquote. And there is also another characterization which is given by Venezuelan sociologist Emiliano Terán Mantovani, who adds to this argument by claiming that neo-extractivism can be interpreted as a particular mode of accumulation, especially with respect to Latin American country, which can be studied from the social and territorial scope encompassed by the nation state without detriment to other scales of territorial analysis. Now, other words consider extractivism as a style of development based on the extraction and appropriation of nature, which feeds, and I'm quoting from Gudinas, from Eduardo Gudinas, feeds a scarcely diversified productive framework and is very dependent on international suppliers or raw materials, end of quote. So for Gudinas, extractivism refers to more a mode of appropriation than a mode of production. That is a type of extraction of natural resources that refers to activities that remove large volumes of unprocessed or limited natural resources for export. Now, there are also historical links between the term extractivism and the activity of extractivism on one side and religious, philosophical, and economic beliefs on the other side. So one could say that the way in which extractivism has been developed has to do, or is more frequently has to do with, for example, Christian beliefs, anthropocentric belief, and so-called growthist belief, so the belief in the necessity of state growth. And these are this kind of three classes of beliefs are sometimes summarized as the Western mindset. Now, today we are in, as I mentioned, in the phase of neo-extractivism, which the characterization of which I have already given. I'm not saying that transnational companies are no longer active in this business. They are, but together with transnational companies, we also have national governments, and not only the national governments of developing countries, but also, for example, of BRICS. Just think of Brazil, for example. And probably with the expansion of so-called smart technologies and expansion of electric vehicles, there's going to be a new extractivist paradigm that is going to take place also in Europe at some point. There was quite a short time ago, there was this conflict that came to the headlines of newspapers of this new mine of lithium that was going to be opened in Serbia, and about the protests of environmental movements against the opening of this mine. And there is talk about opening a couple of mines again in France. So it's something that is probably going to get back to Europe in a certain way over a relatively short time. Now, why would I divide and separate this thing, energy extractivism from any other source of extractivism? Well, in fact, we don't have to distinguish them. They are guided by the same principles of exploiting natural elements or resources, as we used to call them in a certain anthropocentric way. And so exploiting these resources for the benefit of companies, of states, and according to the state and the company's narratives, also the people of those places. Now, here I do make the distinction because of the role of that energy resources has today and will have in the global economy. That's why I'm focusing on energy extractivism as opposed to, let's say, agricultural extractivism. Here, for example, you can see what minerals that are contained in normal mobile phones. I'm not going to read them, but you can see it from yourself that there's about 12 to 15 minerals that are particularly important in the manufacturing of one mobile phones. We have even more of these elements for the manufacturing of computers. We have different materials for electric vehicles and smart meters. So all these technological apparatus that is becoming more and more widespread over the last 20 to 30 years, and will become even more widespread over the next few decades, will have to be extracted somewhere if we continue with this mode of usage of resources. And this is a map of Africa that shows you which country from which country these minerals are mainly extracted. It's just showing you for each country on the map that is colored, the main mineral that is extracted. Is not the only one, of course. So, for example, phosphates in Morocco, gold in Mali, iron in Mauritania, titanium in Kenya, diamond in Lesotho, salt in Namibia, etc., etc. So sometimes, especially when I show these maps to African or South American audiences, they arguably they fume about those, because this is a map of an exploitation from an exploitation point of view. So we see countries from the kind of minerals that we can extract from them, whereas we don't have the same kind of vision of Europe usually. Now, how did all of this come about? I will start from the early 20th century. So before going to this very contemporary picture of this amount of minerals, let's start looking at what was the main source of energy back in the beginning of the 20th century. So back in the day, as you can see from these two tables on the right, the so-called West, so the Europe and and North America, including, it had 30% of the world's population and used about 95% of all the fossil fuels extracted. What happens during the 20th century is that the Western world increases its total energy use for nearly about 15 times. And it's true that the share of global energy used by the West declines during time, but it's also true that by the end of the 20th century, the West consumed nearly 50% of all primary commercial energy, having only 15% of the population. This situation slightly changes in the 2010s when China overtakes the United States in terms of consumption, but also in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the turnaround happens in 2010. And by 2015, China was about 32% ahead of the US in terms of total consumption. But obviously, in terms of per capita consumption and energy used, it was only a third of the US mean value. So we are in a situation where there are large countries that are increasing their use of energy. I'm also thinking of India, Nigeria, Brazil. But at the same time, the per capita usage, it's still very low compared to compared to the US or to the European Union. Another thing I did is I decided not to talk about wood, and I could have started with wood instead of coal, but I decided to not talk about wood because in terms of the global market in the 20th century, wood has not generated the kind of practices that later energy sources have on the same scale. In fact, even coal, for a large part of its history of extraction, has been mainly nationally sourced and used. By the late 20th century, coal was for the most part replaced in domestic as well as industrial and transportation usage by oil, natural gas, or electricity produced from oil, gas, nuclear power, or renewable energy sources. So that's why I decided to focus on oil. Now, what happened since the 1890s is coal mining has also been a political and a social issue. And this is, as you mentioned, this is highlighted by Timothy Mitchell in his works, not only by him, but it's definitely the main reference in this field. The labor and trade union, the labor from coal miners and trade union, coal trade union became powerful in many countries in the 20th century. And often the miners were leaders of the left or socialist parties, socialist movements. And that happened in Britain, in Germany, but also in Poland, Japan, Chile, Canada, and the US. And in the years just before 1914, the world's major navies began to shift towards replacing coal with oil in hopes of gaining speed and maneuverability, and also cutting refueling time. Typical example was Winston Churchill, the British statesman, as First Lord of the Admiralty. He was one of the great champions of the Royal Navy's switch to oil from coal. One source explains that despite many advantages that oil held over coal for naval ships, for example, it was cleaner, easier to refuel, it was more powerful. The fact that Britain did not own a supply of oil made the decision to switch quite painful. So instead of relying on national oil, national coal, they would have to rely on oil taken somewhere else. And I'm quoting here from Gray, said, with it, Britain bought a majority share of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and the age of petropolitics began, unquote. This is for Britain, but also in the US, it was the Spanish-American War of 1898 that changed the US Navy's mind about using coal for fuel. And so with the switch by the British Navy and the American Navy, we already have two major powerhouses that are switching from coal to oil. In his book, Carbon Democracy, Timothy Mitchell tells a radical new story about rise of democracy. And he claims coal was a source of energy so open to disruption that oligarchies in the West became vulnerable for the first time to mass demands for democracy. It was precisely this power that the states wished to decrease by switching to oil, which was a resource that could easier be controlled and didn't need all the workforce that coal did. So what happens is that between 1940s and 1970s, coal was widely replaced by hydrocarbons. And since the 1970s, environmental issues have been increasingly important, including the health of miners, destruction of the landscape from strip mines and mountaintop removal, as well as air pollution and coal combustion's contribution to global warming. So these are problems that started to be popular later in the history. So until the 1970s, there were not major political concerns, although there were indeed individuals that were concerned about these problems. Now, production of coal in the European Union has been decreasing almost continuously from the 1990s, and more consistently than consumption. In 2021, the European Union's production was 57 million tons, which was 79% less than the 277 million tons of 1990. Now, this is amazing, right? But the problem is that the EU is not the whole world. So if you look at the other charts here, now we can see that the consumption of coal has been globally increasing during time. And while we were happy in 2013 to see that China had reached his peak, or at least it seemed like they had reached his peak, in fact, it was not so. And we had a rebound effect in 2021 after during the pandemic, and especially after the end of the pandemic. So a new peak for coal consumption was reached by China just in 2021. Now, despite a slowing global economy and despite lockdown in China, the natural gas prices have been soaring, also especially following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And this is stimulating again the use of coal this year. Just thinking, based on the current economic and market trends, global coal consumption is forecast to rise by about 0.7% in 2022, assuming that Chinese economy recovers as expected in the second half of the year, according to the International Energy Agency's coal market update into 2022. Now, this global total would match the annual record set in 2013, and coal demand is likely to increase further next year to a new all-time high, according again to the IEA. In terms of worldwide coal consumption, this rebounded by about 6% in 2021 as the global economy recovered rapidly from the initial shock of the COVID-19 pandemic. And this sharp rise contributed significantly to the largest ever annual increase in global energy-related CO2 emissions in absolute terms, putting them at the highest level in history. So we are in a situation where actually coal consumption is increasing again. Now, because I have a limited amount of time, so it would be interesting to talk more about coal, but I prefer to just switch to historically to progress to what happened after the era, or rather than after the era of coal was ended, after the era of coal as the predominant energy used in the Western world ended. This was, as I mentioned, it was started to be replaced by oil, and it started to happen basically in the 18th century in the United States, in Russia, well, today is Azerbaijan, in Romania and Poland. What we see is that by 1910, significant oil fields were discovered also in, apart from those 4 countries, also in the Dutch East Indies, which is today Indonesia, as well as in Persia, in Peru, in Venezuela, and in Mexico. And these oil fields were being developed at an industrial level. So they were not just discoveries, they were not just non-commercial discoveries. I'm talking about only commercial discoveries, because obviously there were also other oil discoveries that were not large enough to be then commercially viable. Also, significant oil fields were also exploited in Alberta, in Canada, from 1947. So this is the era where oil starts to be discovered in all over the world, from the 1910s onwards. And in 1920, we have what was called the Red Line Agreement. The Red Line Agreement, why is it important? Well, because the focus of extraction with the Red Line Agreement shifts to the Middle East. From Central America, from Venezuela, and from the areas of Azerbaijan, shifts to the Middle East. And this was an agreement that was signed by partners in the Turkish Petroleum Company, in 1928, and it was signed between the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which then was renamed as British Petroleum, Royal Dutch Shell, which today is called Shell, Compagnie Française de Pétrole, which was later renamed Total after merging with another French company, and the Near East Development Corporation, later renamed ExxonMobil. The aim, and also another character whose name is Calouste Gulbenkian, who is the founder of the museum that today is in Lisbon. The aim of this agreement was to formalize the corporate structure of the Turkish Petroleum Company, which then became renamed as Iraq Petroleum Company, and bind all partners to a clause that prohibited any of its shareholders from independently seeking oil interests in the former Ottoman Empire. This Red Line Agreement marked the creation of an oil monopoly, or cartel, if you prefer, of immense influence, and it spanned a huge territory, vast territory. American oil companies, Standard Oil of New Jersey, and Socony Vacuum were partners in the IPC, in the Iraq Petroleum Company, and therefore they were bound by the Red Line Agreement. Now, what happens is that in 1933, so 5 years later, Saudi Aramco which is also a joint venture of California, of Standard Oil of California, and sorry, I'm just a bit of a cold. So it was a joint venture between Standard Oil of California and Standard Oil in Texas, Texaco, tries to involve other American companies into a concession that they had signed between with Saudi Arabia. So basically, Standard Company of California had signed a contract with the Saudi Arabian government, and it was not bound by the Red Line Agreement because Standard Oil of California was not part of the Red Line Agreement. So what they tried was to lure in a number of other American companies in their own agreement with Saudi Arabia. And this created a political and geopolitical mess, which you can find more in, if you wish, in the book that I published. I won't talk a lot about this, but the whole cartography of oil concessions in the Arabic Peninsula is completely messed around by the Red Line Agreement and by the attempt made by Standard Oil of California and Saudi Arabia to involve the other American companies in this other concession, which gave rise to the reaction of British government, of the French government, and also of the government of the United States. Long story short, what today is the situation is about 80% of the world's ready accessible reserves are located in the Middle East, and 62% of these 80% comes from the 5 Arabic countries, so Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Iraq, Qatar, and Kuwait. Now, during the 20th century, what also happens apart from the development in the Middle East is there are also the multiplication of extractive activities in South America. In the early 20th century, British and American multinational oil corporation, and to a lesser extent, Canadian and Dutch companies, came face to face in Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Venezuela, Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, Brazil, and Chile, basically almost the whole of South America. And they started to struggle over the control of oil extraction, export operation, and the development of domestic markets, forcing federal governments to reevaluate nationalist land use policies at the expense of local political interest. The Monroe Doctrine would ultimately leave the future of the Western Hemisphere in the hands of the US, allowing American corporations to take over the control of the majority of the supply of oil in the region by the 1920s, as the outcomes of World War I forced the British companies to abandon their interests in the Americas. What we see in the after World War II, so starting from the 1950s, there is an expansion of oil interest into Africa. So former, well, not yet former, but colonial powers start to look for oil also in the African continent. And this situation does not change significantly after the independence of the majority of those countries over the 1960s. Still today, there are quite strong bounds between powers like France or the UK on one side and a number of African countries which export most of their oil and gas either to France or the UK. There was also, starting from the end of World War II, as this was explained by a very good book by Christine Ross called Fast Car, Clean Bodies, a reimagination of Western culture in terms of making it more suitable for oil consumption. So especially after World War II, a new lifestyle was modeled, which hindered a lot on hedonistic, fast and furious consumer goods, the use of cars, the use of plastics, the use of cosmetics, which really made the oil industry expand in a significant way, especially in refining activities in Southern Europe, for example, or in over the Gulf of Mexico in Texas. Just a second, sorry. Yeah. Now, it is astonishing, as F. Bayat said, it is astonishing how little is said currently about those millions of people who toil for oil, the colossal industry that anchors the whole of the global political economy. So this is these are workers that have almost made to disappear in the history of oil. When we look at the history of oil, especially the history of diplomacy of oil, what we see is names of companies, maybe name of the executives, but we don't see what happened to the workers. We almost don't know anything. Or actually, to be more precise, we didn't know much, at least until this book was published in 2018, Working for Oil, Comparative Social Histories of Labor in the Global Oil Industry, by Touraj Atabaki and colleagues. What they do in this book is to, starting from the 1950s, they explore labor in the oil industry in depth from the 1950s on in various regions of the world, from Colombia to Iran, Lebanon, and Soviet Union. And they argue that oil underlies the contemporary civilization of global industrial and consumer capitalism, and the histories and experiences of those working to produce this commodity are embedded within the larger history that include the transformation of international capitalism and finance, colonialism, and decolonization and nationalism, also in global geopolitical conflicts, the core world, etc. For example, in one of the studies that are included in this edited volume that I really suggest you to read if you want to know more about this topic is they report a number, usually they report a vast number of examples of how the oil workers were involved in the determination of political regimes in a number of countries. For example, the 1938 refinery workers in Aguila, Tampico, played a critical role in the nationalization of the Mexican oil industry. The Venezuelan oil workers strike of 1936 set the stage for the passage of the country's hydrocarbon law of 1943, redefining the relationship between host governments and foreign oil firms. And you can find many other examples in this book of exactly of the power of oil workers in political life, everyday political life, which kind of seems to jeopardize Timothy Mitchell's thesis that, you know, after coal, basically oil was made it to flow smoothly, and also because of a lesser workforce, there was not so much that workers could do to stop the oil from flowing. So I think this is also interesting in terms of counter narrative to Timothy Mitchell. So what they also argue is that workers in the oil sector were made to disappear, where they were disempowered through delocalization of plants, automation, de-unionization, temporary work, also divide and rule in terms of racial discrimination, and also the energy security narrative, which made states focus on the need for the states to get enough oil for their industrial needs, but kind of made disappear all these people working in the sector. Now, if we used to think of a handful of African countries as energy producers, in fact, actually the list is much longer and just goes beyond Nigeria, Angola, Algeria, Libya, and Egypt. We can think of Gabon, for example, which was once a medium-sized producer and today is a small producer. We can think of Equatorial Guinea, which is a recent oil producer, and as well as Chad, Congo, or Sudan. So countries that were considered producers in a certain time span exhausted their reserves, while others only acquired the status of oil and gas producers very recently. So that kind of also makes the theory of resource cores a bit shaky, because it kind of helps de-essentialize the character of a nation, of an oil nation, as something that is fixed in time forever. So some countries, of course, have exploited oil and gas for longer. Thinking of Algeria, for example, think of Saudi Arabia, but some other countries have either acquired or lost these status. Now, the colonial enterprise has opened the way for making specific regions one source dependent, so dependent on only one source. And that trend has continued after independence, mainly in the 1970s. And as that happened, as neo-colonial relations have replaced colonial ones, and also as new political elites have resorted to extractivist practices to keep within the export business. So we have a constant increase in extraction due to innovative prospecting methods, and also to the exploitation of other sources of fossil fuels, for example, tight and shale oil and gas. With respect to uranium, we have to think that Kazakhstan alone extracts about 45% of the global uranium, with 22 tons, whereas Namibia, which is the second largest producer, only extracts 12% of the total mineral ore in 2021, and Niger comes 7th, South Africa is 11th, etc. And Gabriel Echt, in this sense, has shown that questions about being nuclear, a state that she calls nuclearity, lies at the heart of today's global nuclear order and the relationships between developing nations, often former colonies, and nuclear powers, often former colonizers. Gabriel Hecht has focused on miners and the occupational hazards of radiation exposure, and on the detection and measurements, or lack of measurements, of radiation in some African mines. By investigating archives in Gabon, Madagascar, Namibia, and South Africa, she found that in the practices of uranium extractivism, the condition of being nuclear, as well as its consequences on health, were contextual upon both workers' knowledge of their working environment and the employer's precautionary measures. This helps us referring back to something that is familiar to all of you, namely the consequences of extractive practices on the health of human beings and, in fact, on the entire ecosystem. Now, by focusing on Africa, I don't want to convey the feeling that I'm downplaying the existence or magnitude of equivalent extractive phenomena in other regions of the world. I focus on Africa because it's both the continent where foreign exploitation of energy resources has been the highest and most evident, and where the extractivist logic has often married the colonial or neo-colonial logic most evidently. But we can think of many other examples of extractivism. Some are more visible and visually impactful than others, which is also why some are better known by the general public than others. Some look tidier, some involve fewer people than others, some happen where we cannot see them, for example, in the deep sea. One of the most visibly impactful extractivist practices is Canada's tar sands in the Alberta region, on the bottom right of this photo. But we can think of solar plants in Morocco, on the bottom left, coal mines in China, top left, or spills from oil pipelines in Peru and Ecuador in the center of this photo, or finally oil shale in Estonia in the top right. So all continents, and they're characterized at different levels and different scales by extractivist activity. Now, concern for the impact on human life of problems such as air and water pollution dates to at least Roman times. Pollution was associated with the spread of epidemic disease in Europe between the late 14th century and the mid-16th century, and soil conservation was practiced in China, India, and Peru as early as 2,000 years ago. In general, however, such concerns did not give rise to public activism, and this is why we don't tend to talk about environmental movements until that date. Now, the contemporary environmental movement arose primarily from concerns in the late 19th century about the protection of the countryside in Europe and the wilderness in the United States, and the health consequences of pollution during the Industrial Revolution. In opposition to the dominant political philosophy of the time, liberalism, which held that all social problems, including environmental ones, could and should be solved through the free market, most early environmentalists believed that government, rather than the markets, should be charged with protecting the environment and ensuring the conservation of resources. Biocentric approaches arose in the preservationist philosophies of John Muir in the late 19th century to the early 20th century. John Muir was the founder of the Sierra Club, which is still today one of the most important NGOs in the United States. And also by Aldo Leopold, also a US citizen operating mainly in the late 19th century, early 20th century, who was a professor of wildlife management, was pivotal in the designation of the first national forest in New Mexico as a national park, as an American protected land. But we also have other examples. For example, we have Sweden established 9 national parks in 1909. It was the first in Europe to do that. Switzerland created a national park of 14,000 hectares in 1914. New Zealand, the Native Bird Protection Society arose in 1923, also for conservation purposes. And at that time, 4 pillars provided a unifying theme to the broad goals of political ecology. These were protection of the environment, grassroots democracy, social justice, and non-violence. However, for a small number of environmental groups and individual activists who engaged in eco-terrorism, for example, violence was also viewed as a justified response to what they considered the violent treatment of nature by some interests, particularly the logging and mining industries. Also, there were links that were developed between environmental movements and human rights movement. This was the case of the Cicle movement in India, which linked forest protection with the rights of women, or the Assembly of the Poor in Thailand, which was a coalition of movements fighting for the right to participate in environmental and developmental policies. The most successful environmental party, so we have movements, we have parties. Parties, environmental parties and green parties usually start taking a prominent role, well, relatively prominent role, starting from the 1980s, and in a very selected number of countries. We have the German Green Party that was founded in 1980, and although it failed to win representation in federal elections in 1980, it entered the parliament in both 1983 and 1987 with percentage ranging from 5 to 8%. And also in 2021, so in the last German federal elections, the Green Party managed to reach about 9%, and it became part of the ruling coalition. Now, this is a very specific Green Party. This was not generalizable to the story of the Green parties in Europe. Only a few countries in general, a few countries in Europe and in the world have Green parties that have a certain significance, politically speaking. But the changing nature of the political debate on the environment was also reflected in the organization of a number of conferences, and especially the 1992 United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, which was attended by about 180 countries and various business groups, non-governmental organizations, and the media. Now, I don't know how much time I have left. Probably not that much, I guess. Probably I'm already over my time. How much time do I have, Ramon?
You have 5-10 minutes more. You can take your time.
Thanks. Then I have a bit of time to talk about environmental justice and how this was born and how it gave birth, in a certain sense, to energy justice. So environmental justice, we can say that it was born in a certain sense in the early 1980s, especially in 1982, when the state of North Carolina in the US announced a plan to move soil contaminated with PCBs from alongside 200 miles of the state's roadside to a landfill located in Warren County, one of only a few counties in the state with a majority of Black population. This decision triggered a wave of protest, one of which resulted in the arrest of a US congressman and dozens of other activists who tried to block the trucks containing PCB at the entrance of the landfill. In this photo, you can see, you can barely see protesters led by Reverend Joseph Lowry marching against one of the dumps. International formalization of environmental justice began with the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in 1991. This summit was held in Washington, D.C., and was attended by over 650 delegates from every US state, as well as Mexico, Chile, and other countries. Delegates adopted 17 principles of environmental justice, which were circulated at the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio. And among all principles, Principle 10 of the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development states that individuals shall have access to information regarding environmental matters, participation in decision, and access to justice. So the more justice is mentioned in this principle, and environmental justice has become a very broad global movement, contributing several concepts to political ecology that have been adopted or formalized in the academic literature, such as ecological debt, environmental racism, climate justice, food sovereignty, corporate accountability, ecocide, sacrifice zones, and environmentalism of the poor, and many others. Now, the problem with many energy as projects, and here I come back to energy from the environment, is that ethical aspects are often neglected in when setting up an energy project. And the questions of who benefits from and who is affected by energy projects is barely, or used to be at least, barely heard in project managing. For also, who has the right to take part in decision making? This is a concern that seems to be pretty recent. What formal and informal procedure take account of justice aspect as well? So these are three sets of questions that gave rise to three definition of energy justice in terms of distributional energy justice, procedural energy justice, and recognition energy justice, that are at the basis of the modern academic concept of energy justice. Now, one mistake that we should not make is to consider that the concept of energy justice was created in the academia. It existed before the 2010s. It was mainly developed by indigenous communities, First Nation communities in the US, who created, among other things, the Energy Justice Network in the 2000s. So these concepts were already going around, although they were not formalized they were not conceptualized quite very clearly. But in 2010s is where the energy justice concept starts to be popular in the academia. Today we have a Center for Energy Ethics in St Andrews, Scotland, but also we have, of course, other institutions dealing with energy issues, with energy justice, such as the SPRU in Sussex. We have the University of Edinburgh. We have, well, I mean, the ICTA, where I'm based. So I mentioned the three elements of distribution, recognition, and procedures. And fourth element was added in 2019, in 2019, yes, which is the cosmopolitan principle, which basically states that energy justice is a global system that has to fairly disseminate both the benefits and costs of energy savings, and one that has representative and impartial decision making. So, sorry, this is the definition of energy justice as we have it now. The cosmopolitan justice suggests that principles that, such as those from the distributive and the procedural justice, must apply universally to all human beings in all nations. They imply that transport and mobility choices and technologies entail responsibilities that are global in scope across the whole system. Now, this mention of the whole system was translated and transformed into another view of energy justice, which I will talk about in a second, which is the whole system approach. Before talking about the whole system approach, just a few clarification of what I mean by distributional, recognition, and procedural justice. So distributional justice usually looks at where are key impacts located. It also takes into account variation in times, in impacts and the risks to future generations. So who is paying the costs of energy extraction, energy implementation, and who is getting the costs. Recognition justice looks at where do inequalities emerge. Who should we focus on when we think of energy victims? And the procedural justice responds to the question, is stakeholders' right to fair process being respected? Now, these are stylization. So it's not only reducing the three aspects of distribution, recognition, and procedure only to this question would be reductive. But time is what it is. So I just mentioning these ones. And now I think one thing I need to mention also before just briefly mentioning the whole system approach is that this has been criticized, this approach to energy justice has been criticized as a mainly Western-centric approach, so based on Western philosophies. So what about, is it correct to apply it everywhere? Of course, probably not. How can we do to make it more plural, to make it more suitable to local mindsets, to local Weltanschauungs, to say it this way? And several other approaches have been developed, for example, in using Ubuntu philosophy concept from Africa, Taoism, Confucianism, and not only religious and philosophical approaches, but also other views of other non-anthropocentric views, biocentrism, ecocentrism, anti-specism, etc. So ways of looking at nature and the ecosystem that do not only take account of the costs and benefits for human beings. I would like to spend some more time on this, but I think we don't have so much time. So let me just tell you that this is another alternative way of framing energy justice. Instead of using the three tenets of distribution, procedure, and recognition, using a number of other principles that are 8 principles that have been coined by Benjamin Sovacool, and that are considering on a more, if you wish, pragmatic way how to study energy justice in factual cases. So I would say that the previous approach is more theoretical, and this one is definitely more pragmatic. It looks at availability, affordability, due process, information, prudence, intergenerational equity, and responsibility. We can talk about this later if you wish. One last slide on the whole system approach that looks throughout time and throughout space. So it looks at impacts of energy systems, not only in the place where energy is transformed, or where the energy plant, power plant is located, but also in places where the energy sources were extracted, and what happens also after, let's say, a solar panel is used, what happens to the waste coming from these energy systems, how it is managed. So it looks at different, at the production, consumption, and waste disposal, but also looks at different scales, micro scale, for example, the local impacts, the meso scale, or the national or super local level, and the macro scale. What happens where, for example, energy infrastructures or energy technologies are traded transnationally or beyond single countries. And just want to finish with this quote from Benjamin Sovacool, which I think is very telling of a whole system approach, which is when we think of an energy approach, an energy system, you have to think that a French restaurant using nuclear electricity to bake croissants connects with a worker inhaling toxic fumes at a uranium mine in Niger or Canada, from where nearly half of France's uranium imports come from. A British household using their smart meter and in-home display to monitor their laundry is generating electronic waste that could end up in the fields and farms of Ghana. A parent picking up their children from school in an electric vehicle in Norway depends in part on the back-breaking labor of mineral extraction across the cobalt mines in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And a German solar panel supporting a pensioner's retirement in Berlin may have been manufactured at a low-wage factory in China. Now, I will skip this and just thank you for your attention and apologize for exceeding my time.
Thank you very much for this overview, this discussion about energy justice, a very interesting issue you mentioned. And let me give the floor to my colleague Ignacio Soy, who will organize the debate with all the participants here. Please, Ignacio.
Yes, thank you very much, Roberto, for your excellent talk. And also thank you for the more than 20 people that is now in the seminar. All of you are invited to send your questions by using the chat or even with the microphone. You just need to raise the hand using the icon you have below. So go ahead with your questions, your comments, and your possible debate, which we can start from now during 20-30 minutes. Perhaps I can start with a question. I don't know if I can continue in another language. In the majority of the people here is not. It's a variety of language. In any case, I can continue in English. There is not a problem. My question would be about the last slides you explained and how the logics of extractivism applies to coal, to oil, but also to green energy, no, or as has been labeled, green energies. So can you develop a little bit more how to manage or how to connect the 8 principles, as you say, more pragmatic points of Sobakul, no? Sobakul, the author you mentioned, with this logic of extractivism applied to green energies? Thank you, Roberto.
Thank you for your question. It's definitely the logic of extractivism can be applied, and in fact is applied also to renewable energy sources. A common misconception that we have is that because energy sources are in theory endless in a sense, or rather than being endless, they have a much longer, much longer way of exhaustion, then the logic of extractivism doesn't really apply, because for as much energy as you can get from a windmill, you will always have more energy coming in. But the problem is, one of the problems of this logic is actually the mindset with which this infrastructure project are mostly conceived and built. One example of this kind of neo-colonial mindset, if you wish, or extractivist mindset, was there was a project, there was a plan for a project called Desertec, which was supposed to be built in part of the Sahara Desert. It was a solar plant, and I can't remember how many hundreds of gigas. And it was supposed to feed the energy to part of North Africa, but especially be sent over to Europe through submarine cables, high tension submarine cables. And the logic behind this project was that, well, the Sahara Desert is empty, so there are no population that are living there. So you can basically use the empty space to produce energy that will be used not only for Europeans, but also for the North African economies. But obviously that is that concept of Sahara Desert as something empty and something that doesn't have, in a sense, a commercial value or even a symbolic value is very controversial, not to say completely wrong. First of all, because there are nomadic populations in the area. Secondly, because if you take a non-anthropocentric view, an ecosystem is not only made by human beings. So there is an existing ecosystem in a place, and you have to take care of that ecosystem. And also the idea of placing a huge infrastructure in Africa to use electricity for Europe really smacked of some other previous projects made with oil or gas. Another issue, for example, another example on a smaller scale is what the Kingdom of Morocco is doing today in Western Sahara. So the government of Morocco conceived a plan, designed a plan, like a very ambitious and very, I would say, very vast, huge project to build solar and wind infrastructures in its territory, and including Western Sahara. And it managed, because it's a mainly, the aim was to get to 42% of national electricity produced from renewables. So because of the significance of this project, and also because it was going to use renewables, it managed to acquire the adequate funding from international financial institutions to be able to implement this project. And today it is conducting this project. Part of these plants have already been built, especially there is one in Ouarzazate, which is called Noor. It's about 600 megawatts. There is the wind farm in Tarfaya as well. But there is also there are also wind farms and solar plants that are being built in the occupied territories. And that, of course, is problematic, because the Polisario Front, which is the legitimate authority in Western Sahara, is claiming that by doing that, the Moroccan authorities are trying to legitimize the status quo of the occupation. So this is also an extractive logic, and also because the energy that would be produced from the solar plants and wind farms in Western Sahara would be used for companies that are mainly Moroccan and are benefiting the Moroccan industry, not the Western Sahara industry. So the geopolitical factors and industrial factors always come together when it comes especially to these renewable energy projects. And I think we as, maybe not as analysts, but I think in general as the media tend to pay less attention to geopolitical issues regarding renewable energy, because the current narrative is all about the development of this kind of infrastructure. It's easier to catch the eye of the media when there is an oil spill or an oil pipeline, because the pipeline is crossing many countries, because we are used to accidents happening to oil and gas pipelines. Well, I mean, not to speak of uranium, but we are less used to see these kind of geopolitical challenges coming from renewable energies. And in terms of how to study it using the 8 principles, I think I don't know any single study that has been used the whole 8 principles mentioned by Sovacool. It's very hard to use the whole of them in one single study. It's probably possible to use them in a book. So one has to choose which one are the most relevant to study each individual study. Usually with the ones that are taken more frequently are availability, which is the principle that holds that people deserve sufficient energy resources of high quality. The principle of affordability, which states that all people, including the poor, should pay no more than 10% of their income for energy services. And the principle of due process, which holds that countries should respect the rule of law and human rights in their production and use of energy. So these are 3 parameters that are easier to evaluate in a sense than other parameters, such as, for example, intergenerational equity. You know, if you wanted to analyze intergenerational equity, probably you would need a longitudinal study over a quite long time span, and it's not as easy to assess as other indexes. And then there is also another problem, that is there are some parameters that are not easily to quantify, and they have more to do with cultural values than with measurability. And when something cannot be measured easily, or when something cannot be measured at all, it automatically disappears from most environmental impact assessments. It's not considered, or is only considered in the appendixes, or is just considered in the introduction, but not really something that, let me use the word technocrats, but in the most possible neutral, in the most neutral possible way. So engineers and economists can easily deal with, because the terms, the world of terms that is being used by different actors in a project, in an energy project, are referred to different metaphysics, and this makes it very difficult for sets of people that are coming from different academic tradition, or from non-academic tradition, from activist tradition, from NGO, to communicate between themselves. And I think that when for example, activists decide to use an economic language in order to counter the techno-managerial narrative, it can backfire. It's a strategy that can backfire, because yes, you can use economic arguments so that your antagonist understands you better, but at the same time you are reducing your worldview only to this kind of technological and more measurable sub-world, sub-reality.
Thank you very much, Roberto. Cambiamos de idioma, tenemos una pregunta del profesor José Antonio Chamizo de México, que además está muy relacionado con esto que estabas explicando de cómo medir estas cuestiones y lo de las barreras de la pericia, ¿no? Y cómo, entonces su pregunta es que gracias por la conferencia y qué se puede derivar de ello, y especialmente se pregunta si las soluciones están en la educación y que cómo se puede modificar nuestra manera de vivir 8.000 millones de personas.
Pues muy buena pregunta. Yo creo que las soluciones serían varias y tienen varios pesos y varios plazos de implementación. La educación, claro, puede ser un parámetro muy importante, pero no puede ser el único. Entonces, creo que tenga que haber, por un lado, la educación, por otro lado, también proponer la propuesta de modelos alternativos, modelos económicos alternativos al modelo vigente, que puede parecer utopía, pero en realidad es lo que se está haciendo ya. Por ejemplo, con el modelo, hay modelos más, entre comillas, extremos y menos extremos. Un modelo menos extremo sería el modelo de la donut economy, ¿no? La economía del donut. O sea, hay varios parámetros físico-químicos de la Tierra que se van midiendo, algunos están ya medidos, y se ve, utilizando estos 10, 15 parámetros, cómo está actuando, o sea, cómo está actuando la Tierra, no tiene sentido, cómo están actuando los seres humanos en la Tierra. Quiero decir, por ejemplo, gradiente químico del tal mineral en el agua de los océanos, cuáles son los valores mínimos y máximos permitidos, y estamos a un nivel superior a lo máximo permitido, estamos en la banda de tranquilidad, estamos por debajo, y eso se está haciendo, y hay algunos parámetros que nos dicen que ya estamos por mucho por arriba, por los niveles máximos químico-físicos del planeta, o sea que se tendría que volver a equilibrar estos parámetros. Luego también modelos más, yo los llamo extremos, pero en realidad no debería llamarles extremos, porque a mí me parece, ¿no? Como desde el punto de vista de la ecología política, de la ecología política crítica, que el modelo más extremo que tenemos es el actual. Pero, digamos, un modelo alternativo podría ser el modelo del decrecimiento. El modelo del decrecimiento, que a pesar del nombre que espanta a muchísimos economistas, es un modelo que que se va refinando de año en año y que está basado en una concepción distinta de la utilización de los recursos y también de nuestra relación con el ecosistema. Digamos, un modelo que no es solo un modelo económico, sino un modelo, si uno quiere, de vida distinto, que vale tanto a nivel individual como a nivel colectivo, porque a nivel individual, obviamente, que el nivel individual es el nivel como que hoy se ve como primario, ¿no? Porque es más fácil para cada uno de nosotros decidir, tomar una decisión. No voy a coger menos aviones, menos vuelos durante el año, de manera que mi huella carbónica sea menor. Voy a dejar de comer carne o voy a reducir el consumo de carne. O yo qué sé, voy a utilizar una compañía que solo produzca energía de recursos renovables. Bien, todo eso está bien, pero hasta que no cambie la manera de producción, hasta que no cambie la manera también de hacer marketing, de ver el consumo como, o sea, de poner el énfasis en la producción y en el consumo, yo dudo que pueda haber cambios radicales. Se tendría que replantear el proceso de producción a priori, yo creo, y se tendría que... y esto no va a salir todo solo. O sea, yo no, igual tengo... Igual estoy un poco desconfiado, pero no creo que pueda haber un grupo o un conjunto de empresarios, empresarias que se pongan de acuerdo para decir, bueno, mira, el mundo está como está, pues vamos a renunciar a una parte de nuestros provechos y vamos a reducir la producción y yo no creo que no creo que eso pueda pasar. Entonces creo que tendrían que ser los gobiernos a tomar decisiones de este tipo. Luego, entiendo que es una posición política, que cada uno tiene la suya, pero creo que, y sobre todo, tampoco creo que sea necesario que cambien la manera de vivir 8.000 millones de personas, porque en realidad los que producen más polución y contaminación no son 8.000 millones de personas, sino que son las personas y los estados de básicamente Norteamérica, Europa, ahora se van subiendo China, Brasil, pero en realidad, o sea, a nivel de consumo y de historia, de cronología del consumo, sobre todo Europa, Estados Unidos y Canadá. O sea, es un número bastante reducido de países cuyos habitantes han vivido y están viviendo todavía por arriba de las que son los límites del planeta. Y yo creo que antes se tendría que enfocar la atención en las industrias de estos países, en las poblaciones de estos países. Y también otro parámetro es que tampoco, incluso al interior de cada país, incluso al interior de Estados Unidos, no todo el mundo produce y consume de la misma manera. Y si hay un 1% que consuma, no sé, digo una cifra ahí acaso, que consuma el 20% de los recursos del mundo y hay un 50% que consume el 2% de recursos, es la primera categoría que tendría que cambiar su manera en principio a priori y luego los demás. Entonces, también por eso yo creo que no sea muy útil, o por lo menos que no sea muy analíticamente poderoso hablar de antropoceno, y estoy más en en un matiz que dio Jason Moore, que es de capital-oceno. O sea, ya no es la especie humana que ha producido lo que ha producido, sino una parte muy pequeña de la especie humana que ha tenido la manera, que ha tenido los recursos y financieros y industriales y tecnológicos como para producir lo que ahora estamos viviendo, que es una crisis ecológica. Eso tiene relación con la economía circular. Puede tener
Sí,
relación.
supongo que se refería al modelo del decrecimiento, ¿no? Y lo que estabas explicando.
Sí y no. Yo creo que si lo preguntaras a analistas, a estudiosos del decrecimiento, te dirían que la economía circular es parte de esta nueva jerga de green growth, como de crecimiento verde, de una manera, es como una especie de neolengua, una novlang, para decirnos que al final todo se puede reciclar y todo puede entrar nuevamente a hacer parte del ciclo productivo, aunque eso en realidad no funcione así, porque la economía es una economía entrópica. O sea, el carácter de la economía en la naturaleza es una economía entrópica. O sea, que se van perdiendo un porcentaje de energía y de materiales, aunque uno, por más que uno quiera hacer una economía circular, siempre hay una parte de recursos que se van a perder y otra parte de recursos que se van a tener que extraer para volver a alimentar el ciclo. O sea, que la economía circular 100% no existe simplemente porque la naturaleza no está hecha de esta manera. Y eso es algo que, sobre todo la gente que como Joan Martínez Allier o Mario Giampietro, que han trabajado mucho con el concepto de economía circular y de entropía física, son muy críticos hacia el concepto de economía circular. Pero otra manera de entender la economía circular podría ser, digamos, de manera no literal, como entender como una cantidad creciente de reciclaje de materias primeras. ¿Primeras? Sí, no. Y en este caso solo podríamos hablar de economía circular con un sentido. O sea, creo que tendríamos que estar conscientes de que cuando hablamos de economía circular es un concepto analítico que puede ser muy ambiguo. Puede ser muy ambiguo según como uno lo entienda. Y tenemos que entenderlo de una manera más ancha y no de una manera rigurosa, porque de manera rigurosa en realidad, como decía antes, no hay una economía circular, no puede haber una economía circular 100%.
Muchas gracias, Roberto. Sí, adelante, José Ramón.
Sí, gracias por estas cuestiones y siguiendo con ellas, ¿no? De la forma de llevar adelante estos conceptos y ponerlos en la práctica, ¿no? Esta ética de la energía en acción. Me gustaría que comentaras algunos de los proyectos en los que has trabajado o lo que has estado, ¿no? Creo que ahora en octubre estuviste en esta conferencia de Just Transition, el platform, ¿no? Que está organizada por la Comisión Europea y, bueno, donde se planteaba como un punto de contacto entre activistas, personas de la industria, personas de políticos, ¿no? Al más alto nivel y el mundo académico, ¿no? Me gustaría un poco que contaras desde este punto de vista esa experiencia.
Sí, esa es creo que ya la séptima, octava conferencia, encuentro sobre la transición justa que se hace a nivel europeo, porque a partir de, mira, hacen una todos los 6 meses, me parece. Y entonces, como hay, desde hace 4 años, cuando se lanzó el concepto de transición justa y se lanzó también la financiación de lo que es la transición justa, se creó una plataforma para juntar a una parte considerable de expertos y expertas sobre cuestiones de transición energética, sobre todo en las regiones más afectadas por cierre de plantas de carbón o cierres de minas. Es el caso del sur de Polonia, es el caso del norte-oeste de Grecia, es también el caso de Asturias, en España, y de otras regiones que también tienen plantas térmicas. Hay también en Andalucía, por ejemplo, en Galicia. Entonces, yo creo que es una plataforma muy interesante para intercambiar opiniones y para que los actores sociales se estén al tanto de lo que está pasando a nivel político sobre cuestiones de este nivel. Hay algunos procedimientos que pueden llegar a ser virtuosos. Por ejemplo, los agentes que intervinieron en la mesa redonda de transición justa de Grecia, luego intentaron crear una conferencia de alcaldes de regiones afectadas por coal intensive regions, no sé, afectadas con alta intensidad de carbono, y crearon esta plataforma, crearon este foro donde pues los alcaldes se juntaban en varios lugares e iban hablando, iban confrontándose sobre las maneras distintas de favorecer la transición energética en varias regiones. Yo creo que eso es muy importante a nivel de organizaciones locales, porque es claro que al final, dependiendo del país, las regiones y las autoridades locales pueden tener más o menos poder. Hay países donde a nivel local el poder es muy poco, es muy débil, por ejemplo, Polonia. Hay países donde hay una estructura más federativa, como Alemania, donde ya las autoridades locales las regiones o los estados, en el caso de Alemania, tienen más capacidad de decidir y más poder de gestionar los recursos que le llegan desde Europa y desde el país, desde el gobierno federal. Entonces también depende mucho de cada país. Pero en general creo que es un procedimiento, una plataforma que puede servir tanto a los activistas para entender lo que pasa a nivel político, sino también y sobre todo al nivel político para saber lo que pasa a nivel local, a nivel territorial, y cuáles son las iniciativas que se están desarrollando a nivel local por movimientos activistas, por comités cívicos y etcétera. Y eso no es banal porque muchas veces esos grupos cívicos o ONG del territorio están más al tanto y están más conscientes de los detalles de lo que está pasando a nivel social en el territorio, más que los políticos de la Comisión Europea, por evidentes razones que ellos trabajan con un nivel superior de administración. Y luego hay que ver, eso dicho, hay que ver si al final de todas estas conferencias habrá algo de práctico. O sea, quiero decir, si además de las palabras y de los encuentros, ¿qué va a pasar a nivel territorial? Porque también es muy fácil y lo que está pasando a menudo en proyectos energéticos es de pretender involucrar a la población, a una parte de la población, pero en realidad esta población no tiene un poder decisional, no sé si se dice así.
Poder de decisión.
Poder de decisión. Entonces, como a veces se concreta es la participación en una participación que es muy proforma. Es muy proforma y se queda así. Entonces, al final, no se permite un empowerment de compartos compartos de la población, y se les da esta especie de caramelito, ¿no? Es decir, bueno, habéis participado, habéis expresado vuestra opinión y bueno, tendremos en cuenta. pero no hay ningún tipo de vínculo, o sea, no hay ningún tipo de feedback, de retroacción entre lo que se discute en estas plataformas y luego lo que se hace a nivel práctico.
Gracias. No sé si puedo seguir con otra cuestión. En tu trabajo siempre has adoptado una perspectiva comparada y transnacional, ¿no? Y claro, la historia de la energía se presta particularmente para ello, ¿no? Pero también acabas de señalar ahora que el propio concepto de justicia o de ética de la energía, ¿no? Plantea una dificultad para trabajar en ese entorno global, precisamente por las cuestiones eurocéntricas, ¿no? que muchas de estas propuestas pues encarnan en valores europeos, ¿no? Que son difíciles de trasladar a otros lugares. Y me gustaría que desarrollaras un poco esta cuestión, ¿no? Me ha interesado mucho el artículo que has hecho, ¿no? Con Benjamin Sobakul y David Hess, ¿no? Sobre transiciones energéticas y la idea de intentar proponer un marco global donde también está incluida esta cuestión, ¿no? De la justicia. Y claro, aplicarlo a situaciones tan diferentes como Papúa Nueva Guinea, ¿no? El esquisto, el gas de esquisto allí, la energía nuclear en Francia. Creo que también hablas de Grecia, energía eólica, si no me equivoco. ¿En qué medida es posible, ¿no? Establecer ese marco global que incluya también unas nociones éticas compartidas, que no sean eurocéntricas y que nos permitan comparar toda esta serie de escenarios tan diversos, ¿no? Donde incluimos tipos de energía, en principio, aparentemente tan diferentes, ¿no? Y espacios, contextos sociales y culturales tan diversos.
Pues muchas gracias por la pregunta, porque es exactamente el tema que estoy intentando desarrollar en un proyecto de Consolidator Grant que estoy a punto de enviar, justamente porque uno de los problemas que se ven de manera más inmediata son eso, que estamos intentando aplicar un concepto de justicia pues creado en un contexto político, histórico, social determinado a otros contextos que son distintos desde el punto de vista histórico, social, etc. Y lo que intentamos hacer con Benjamin Sobakul y David Hess fue integrar 3 marcos teóricos distintos sobre justicia energética, responsible research and innovation y prácticas sociales, para intentar hacerlo, o sea, tener un marco teórico cuanto más universal posible. Lo que pasa es que siguen siendo 3 tipologías de marcos teóricos inventados los 3 en el mismo contexto y sobre todo en el contexto angloamericano. Idealmente, lo ideal sería que estudios que utilicen marcos teóricos alternativos sobre la justicia energética y ambiental fueran publicados por universidades africanas, sudamericanas, asiáticas, pero eso en teoría, porque luego en la práctica sabemos que también hay una diferencia, una distinción en términos de distribución de recursos muy amplia entre lo que se llama de manera bastante incorrecta, pero déjenmelo llamar así, el norte global y lo que es el sur global. Entonces, que va a haber menos investigadores, menos investigadoras, menos recursos en la Universidad de Lomé, en Togo, que en la Universidad de Ginebra. Va a haber menos recursos en la Universidad de Katmandú que en la Universidad de Washington. Entonces es un problema, porque al final todo el mundo que trabaja con justicia energética se está preguntando, tendríamos que ampliar, que ensanchar nuestra maleta, nuestro maletín teórico, pero por otro lado nadie lo está haciendo o es muy complejo de hacerlo, porque la única manera en la que se está haciendo esto es implicar a investigadores de otras partes del mundo, el sur global, a trabajar en proyectos en universidades del norte global, o por lo menos a integrar, a crear, fomentar colaboraciones entre varias universidades del sur y del norte global. Y esto creo que pueda, por lo menos en parte, ayudar a diversificar y ampliar la manera de ver los proyectos energéticos. Hay también, por ejemplo, hay estudios europeos que utilizan un enfoque que es un enfoque que se ha creado que se crearon en la mayoría en la India, que es el capability approach. En lugar de tener en lugar de considerar costes, beneficios, procedimientos, etcétera, considerar cuál es la cantidad de energía y cómo se debería utilizar la energía para satisfacer los que son las capabilities esenciales de los seres humanos, que evidentemente cambian según la comunidad. Y creo que puede ser un enfoque como que le permite a un investigador que sea del norte global de adquirir unas herramientas adicionales para examinar situaciones que no se encuentran en el norte global. Podría ser un primer paso. También el problema es otro. El problema también es que normalmente quien trabaja en Energy Justice, en justicia energética, la mayoría no son filósofos. Son personas que vienen, estudiosos que vienen de Science and Technology Studies, o de sociología, o algunos de psicología, pero en realidad para conocer bien otras maneras de interpretación del concepto de justicia, uno tendría que ser un experto de ese concepto de justicia en otras culturas. Y no hay... Y por eso yo creo que lo ideal sería formar un grupo multidisciplinar, bastante heterogéneo, que pueda incluir tanto a expertos de STS como a expertos de derecho, de filosofía, de sociología, antropología. O sea que tiene que ser un proyecto, no lo puede hacer una persona sola. Esa es mi opinión. Yo creo que muy difícilmente una sola investigadora o un solo investigador podría llegar a hacer un análisis tan complejo de este tipo de situaciones, a no ser que haya nacido en el lugar y que haya vivido todo el tiempo, es que haya como se haya empapado en la cultura local y que pueda utilizar esos conocimientos como para analizar un caso en particular.
Gracias. Y buena suerte con la consulta del Gran.
Gracias.
Este tema de la dificultad, ¿no? de la gran cantidad de disciplinas que están asociadas con los problemas de la energía es uno de los temas que trataremos también con Antonio Turiel el día 2 de febrero. Un tema muy complicado, ¿no? Crear los grupos que estás señalando y además venciendo esos equilibrios y venciendo esas desigualdades, ¿no? Esos desequilibrios eurocéntricos y intentando establecer además unas normas o unos valores, ¿no? que tengan un carácter global. Muy complicado.
Hay un libro que salió, creo que fue publicado en 2020, que se llama Energy Justice Across Borders. Es el único que yo sepa. Es una edición colectiva, ¿cómo se llama? Una edit volume. Y creo que es el único libro que se haya escrito sobre varias perspectivas sobre justicia energética. Luego sí hay artículos individuales en varias revistas, sobre todo Energy Research and Social Science. Pero sí, como todavía no hay un marco generalizado y generalizable sobre energía, sobre justicia energética. No sé si lo va a ver.
Gracias.
Sí, bueno, supongo que estamos casi en los momentos de descuento finales, ¿no? Bueno, efectivamente es una cuestión muy complicada. Habéis dicho, también me parece que la conferencia de hoy ha sido excelente para entender un montón de cuestiones e incluso pensar sobre algunas cuestiones que han aparecido en los días pasados, ¿no? El tema este de la fusión nuclear como un sueño tecnológico que va a producir una fuente de energía inagotable, ¿no? Supuestamente inagotable, que en realidad perpetuaría algunas de estas lógicas que nos has ayudado a entender, ¿no? Estas lógicas del extractivismo y que de hecho en un artículo reciente, pues habéis mencionado en varias ocasiones a Turuel, habla del milagro, se refiere a esta tecnología como un milagro tecnomágico o una tecnocaja de Pandora, ¿no? Por todos los problemas que primero actualmente un milagro tecnomágico debido a que no funciona como una fuente inagotable. Y en el caso de que se consiguiera, los problemas que podría ocasionar, ¿no? Pero en todo caso, pues todo lo que nos has explicado nos ayuda a entender mejor estos cantos de sirena, todo el poder el poder de atracción que ha tenido los medios de comunicación, esta tecnología, aunque fuera solo un pequeño apunte, o sea, un pequeño trabajo de laboratorio con que se han producido unos pocos julios de energía. Y a su vez el gran juego de intereses que hay detrás con un laboratorio vinculado a la energía nuclear para la fabricación de bombas nucleares, mientras que hay otros proyectos en diferentes países, algunos que han tenido que ser abortados, como el de Francia. O sea, es evidentemente es una cuestión muy difícil, pero que es necesario incorporar conceptos como los que has mencionado: justicia ambiental, los conflictos medioambientales, diferentes perspectivas culturales y,
Sí.
ha sido de gran ayuda. No sé si habría algún comentario más, alguna pregunta más, o si no.
Lo que acabas de decir sobre como el concepto tecnomágico, ¿cómo era?
Milagro tecnomágico.
Tecnológico. Me gusta mucho como definición y también es una definición que se le puede aplicar y que de hecho hemos visto ya aplicada en varios otros casos. Claro, no tanto milenarista, si me permitís esta definición, como la fusión nuclear, pero con el gas de esquisto se ha visto la misma creación de narrativas. Ahí Polonia iba a ser la nueva Noruega o el nuevo Qatar. Se ha producido toda una narrativa, una narrativa de promesas tecnocientíficas, ¿no? Sería toda una... Eso también tiene que ver también con el concepto de economía de promesas tecnocientíficas, que es un concepto desarrollado por un sociólogo francés que me gusta mucho, se llama Pierre-Benoît Joly, que ha trabajado él sobre todo sobre nuclear. Ser francés es casi obligatorio. Y yo lo he aplicado un poco al gas de esquisto también, para analizando narrativas y creaciones de promesas. Y también tiene que ver con todo el tema de los imaginarios sociotécnicos de Shira Jasanoff, ¿no? Que también, que es otro concepto que creo que se puede aplicar también en la fusión. Bueno, ya me callo, he hablado demasiado.
No. Sería un placer tener otra vez posibilidad de volver a encontrarnos contigo, que nos cuentes tus nuevas investigaciones y que nos pongas al día de toda la historiografía, todos los trabajos que se han venido publicando recientemente, y que también nos has hecho un resumen fantástico y nos has ayudado a tener en cuenta. Siendo así que ya son casi las 8 menos 10, yo creo que casi podemos dar por finalizado el seminario, ¿no? Agradeciéndote de nuevo toda esta magnífica conferencia
No,
y,
gracias a vosotros, muchas gracias, de verdad.
y emplazando a todos los participantes, pues a estar atentos a la organización de esta sesión que estamos pensando para el 25 de enero, como ha dicho José Ramón Bertomeu, como fin de ciclo con una mesa redonda como fin de ciclo de este ciclo de seminarios sobre Energy, Past and Present. Y quizá desearos felices fiestas, happy holidays, y un feliz año 2023.
Y feliz solsticio, que hoy es 21, que hoy es... Ya que estamos.
Muchísimo.
Bueno, muchísimas
Exactamente.
gracias a todos y a todas. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Roberto, y un saludo.
Saludo, gracias.
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 Hasta la próxima. Chao. Gracias.
Muy bien. Voy a dejar de grabar.